Marcus felt the familiar weight of dread as he opened his eyes to another morning. The same ceiling, the same crack in the plaster that resembled a lightning bolt, the same gray light filtering through curtains he hadn't changed in 3 years. But it wasn't the sameness of his surroundings that trapped him, it was the sameness of his thoughts, looping endlessly like a broken record player stuck on a song he'd grown to hate. His brain, that 3-pound universe nestled within his skull, had become his jailer. Every morning brought the same parade of memories, the presentation where he'd stumbled over his words, the relationship that had crumbled because he couldn't express his feelings, the opportunities he'd let slip through his fingers like sand. These weren't just memories, they were living, breathing entities that had taken up residence in his mind, feeding off his attention like parasites. The human brain, scientists have discovered, is fundamentally a prediction machine. Every moment of every day, it processes approximately 11 million bits of information while consciously acknowledging only about 40. This massive neural network, containing roughly 86 billion neurons connected by trillions of synapses, doesn't simply record experiences, it creates them, interprets them, and often distorts them to fit existing patterns and beliefs. Marcus didn't know these statistics as he shuffled to his kitchen that morning, but he lived their consequences. His brain had learned to expect failure, to anticipate rejection, to prepare for disappointment. These expectations weren't random, they were the result of a complex interplay between various brain regions that had evolved over millions of years to keep him alive, but were now keeping him trapped in patterns that no longer served him. The amygdala, 2 almond-shaped clusters deep within his brain, had catalogued every painful memory with meticulous care. Originally designed to help early humans avoid deadly predators, these ancient structures now treated social rejection and professional setbacks with the same urgency once reserved for saber-toothed tigers. When Marcus thought about applying for a new job or asking someone on a date, his amygdala fired warning signals throughout his system, flooding his bloodstream with stress hormones and triggering the same fight-or-flight response his ancestors experienced when facing mortal danger. But the amygdala wasn't acting alone in this neural conspiracy. The hippocampus, seahorse-shaped and crucial for memory formation, had carefully filed away every detail of his past failures, creating vivid, emotionally charged memories that felt more real than the present moment. These memories weren't simple recordings, they were reconstructions, edited and enhanced each time they were recalled, like a story that grew more dramatic with each telling. As Marcus poured his coffee with shaking hands, his prefrontal cortex, the brain's supposed seat of rational thought, worked overtime to make sense of his anxiety. But, instead of providing clarity, it wove elaborate narratives to explain his fear. "You're not qualified for that position," it whispered. "Remember what happened last time you tried something new? You'll just embarrass yourself again." This inner voice felt so rational, so logical, that Marcus never questioned whether these thoughts were actually helping him or merely perpetuating his prison. The phenomenon Marcus experienced has a name in neuroscience: rumination. It's a cognitive pattern where the brain becomes trapped in repetitive, negative thinking cycles. Research has shown that rumination activates the default mode network, a collection of brain regions that becomes active when we're not focused on the outside world. This network, which includes the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and angular gyrus, was supposed to help humans plan for the future and learn from the past. But, in people like Marcus, it had become hijacked by negative thought patterns, creating a mental echo chamber where past failures reverberated endlessly. Dr. Sarah Chen, a neuroscientist at the fictional Riverside Research Institute, had spent her career studying this phenomenon. Her patients often described feeling like prisoners in their own minds, unable to escape the constant replay of painful memories and self-critical thoughts. What fascinated her wasn't just the persistence of these patterns, but their incredible specificity. The brain seemed to remember every detail of humiliation while forgetting countless moments of success and joy. This selective memory wasn't a bug in the system, it was a feature. Throughout human evolution, forgetting potential dangers could mean death, while forgetting positive experiences was merely inconvenient. The brain's negativity bias, as researchers called it, had kept the species alive for millennia. But, in the modern world, where physical threats were rare and psychological ones abundant, this ancient survival mechanism had become a source of suffering. Marcus's particular brand of mental imprisonment had been years in the making. His brain had learned to associate taking risks with pain, connecting opportunity with failure, linking hope with inevitable disappointment. These connections weren't conscious choices, they were neural pathways carved by repetition, strengthened by emotion, and reinforced by a culture that often celebrated achievement while stigmatizing failure. The neurotransmitters in his brain told their own story of entrapment. Serotonin, often called the happiness chemical, remained chronically low in his system. This wasn't simply a matter of chemical imbalance, it was the result of thought patterns that had literally rewired his brain. When we ruminate, when we replay negative scenarios, when we catastrophize about the future, we're not just thinking differently, we're changing the physical structure of our neural networks. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter associated with motivation and reward, had also been affected by Marcus's mental prison. Originally designed to drive our ancestors toward food, shelter, and mates, dopamine was supposed to surge when we anticipated positive outcomes. But Marcus's brain had learned that anticipation led to disappointment, that hope was a setup for pain. His dopamine system had essentially gone on strike, leaving him feeling unmotivated and disconnected from his own desires. The stress hormone cortisol completed this neurochemical cocktail of misery. Meant to provide short bursts of energy during genuine emergencies, cortisol in Marcus's system had become chronically elevated. His brain treated his daily life like an ongoing crisis, maintaining a state of hypervigilance that exhausted his mental resources and clouded his thinking. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of Marcus's neural prison was its self-reinforcing nature. The more he ruminated, the stronger the rumination pathways became. The more he avoided challenges, the more his brain interpreted normal situations as threatening. The more he focused on his limitations, the more limited he became. He was trapped not by external circumstances, but by the very organ designed to help him navigate the world. The irony wasn't lost on researchers like Dr. Chen. The human brain, capable of composing symphonies, solving complex mathematical theorems, and dreaming impossible dreams, could become its own worst enemy. The same neural plasticity that allowed humans to learn languages, master instruments, and adapt to new environments could also trap them in patterns of self-defeat and despair. As Marcus sat in his kitchen that morning, staring at his coffee growing cold, he couldn't have imagined that within his own skull lay not just the source of his suffering, but also the key to his liberation. The brain that had learned to expect failure could also learn to expect success. The neural networks that had been carved by repetition could be recarved by new experiences. The neurotransmitter systems that had adapted to a life of limitation could be retrained to support a life of possibility. But, first, he would need to understand a fundamental truth that neuroscience was only beginning to reveal: the version of himself that felt so solid, so permanent, so unchangeable, was actually nothing more than a collection of thoughts, memories, and beliefs held together by habit and repetition. This weak self, as ancient philosophers might have called it, wasn't his true nature, it was simply a pattern his brain had learned. And, like any learned pattern, it could be unlearned, transformed, and ultimately transcended. The journey from neural prisoner to neural architect wouldn't be easy. It would require him to challenge every assumption his brain had made about reality, to question every thought it presented as truth, to rewire circuits that had been reinforced for decades. But the alternative, remaining trapped in yesterday forever, was no longer acceptable. Part 2, The Neuroscience of Self-Destruction and Reconstruction. 3 months after that gray morning in his kitchen, Marcus found himself in Dr. Chen's office, not as a patient but as a research participant in her groundbreaking study on neural plasticity and identity transformation. He had volunteered after reading about her work in a scientific journal, the first article he'd forced himself to read in years, fighting against his brain's insistence that he wasn't smart enough to understand complex research. Dr. Chen had been studying what she called identity dissolution and reconstruction in the human brain. Her research suggested that what we consider ourself is actually a dynamic pattern of neural activity that can be consciously altered through specific practices and interventions. The implications were staggering. If the self was malleable at the neural level, then the limitations people believed were permanent features of their personality might actually be changeable patterns of brain activity. "Tell me about your internal voice," Dr. Chen said as she attached EEG electrodes to Marcus's scalp. "The running commentary in your head, what does it typically sound like?" Marcus closed his eyes, immediately aware of the familiar whisper of self-doubt. "It's constantly telling me I'm not good enough. That I'll fail. That I should just play it safe and not try anything new." "It sounds like me," but a version of me that hates me. Dr. Chen nodded, watching the brain activity patterns emerge on her monitor. The default mode network was lighting up exactly as she expected. Regions associated with self-referential thinking, rumination, and negative self-evaluation were showing heightened activity. But what interested her most was a specific pattern she'd begun to identify in her research, the neural signature of what she called the defensive self. The defensive self, according to Dr. Chen's research, was a constellation of brain patterns that emerged from the interaction between memory systems, threat detection mechanisms, and identity formation processes. It wasn't a separate entity living in the brain, but rather a coordinated response of multiple neural networks working together to protect the organism from perceived psychological threats. The problem was that this defensive system, like an overzealous security guard, often protected people from the very experiences that could lead to growth and fulfillment. Marcus, Dr. Chen said, watching the real-time display of his brain activity, I want you to imagine yourself succeeding at something you've always wanted to do. Really picture it vividly. As Marcus began to visualize giving a successful presentation at work, something fascinating happened on the monitoring equipment. The activity in his anterior cingulate cortex, a region associated with conflict monitoring, spiked dramatically. His brain was literally experiencing the imagined success as a threat, activating the same neural circuits that would fire if he were facing actual danger. This is remarkable, Dr. Chen murmured, pointing to the screen. Your brain is treating success as an emergency. The same patterns we see in people confronting physical threats are appearing when you simply imagine a positive outcome. This wasn't uncommon in her research. Many participants had brains that had been so thoroughly trained to expect failure that success itself became cognitively dissonant. The neural networks that had evolved to maintain a consistent sense of self were actively fighting against positive change, interpreting growth as a threat to identity stability. But Dr. Chen's research had also revealed something hopeful: the brain's extraordinary capacity for change. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize and form new neural connections, didn't stop in childhood as scientists once believed. It continued throughout life, meaning that even deeply ingrained patterns of thought and behavior could be modified with the right approach. The key, Dr. Chen explained to Marcus during a break in their session, is understanding that what you call yourself is actually a collection of neural patterns that have become automatic through repetition. These patterns feel permanent because they've been reinforced thousands of times, but they're not unchangeable. They're more like well-worn paths through a forest. They seem like the only way to go because you've walked them so many times, but there are always other routes available. The science behind this was both complex and elegant. Every thought, every emotion, every behavior was the result of specific patterns of electrical activity flowing through neural circuits. When Marcus told himself he wasn't good enough, specific neurons fired in specific sequences, releasing specific neurotransmitters that created the subjective experience of inadequacy. But these same neurons could be trained to fire in different patterns, creating different experiences. The process of transforming these patterns, Dr. Chen had discovered, required what she called conscious neural intervention. This meant deliberately choosing to activate different neural pathways than the ones the brain automatically preferred. It was like learning to write with your non-dominant hand, awkward and difficult at first, but possible with practice. One of the most powerful techniques in her arsenal was something she called pattern interruption therapy. The idea was to catch the brain in the act of running its old programs and consciously choose to run different ones instead. This required developing what neuroscientists called metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe your own thinking processes as they happened. During his next session, Dr. Chen guided Marcus through this process. When you notice the voice telling you you're not good enough, I want you to pause and ask yourself, who is saying this? Is it really you, or is it just an old neural pattern running automatically? As Marcus practiced this technique, something remarkable began happening in his brain scans. The areas associated with metacognitive awareness, particularly the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, began showing increased activity. This region, often called the brain's CEO, was beginning to assert more control over the automatic patterns that had previously dominated his thinking. But the most profound change Dr. Chen observed was in the relationship between different brain regions. In Marcus's initial scans, there had been strong connections between his amygdala, fear center, and his default mode network, self-referential thinking. This meant that his thoughts about himself were constantly tinged with anxiety and threat detection. However, after weeks of pattern interruption practice, these connections began to weaken while new connections formed between his prefrontal cortex, rational thinking, and his anterior cingulate cortex, attention regulation. "You're literally rewiring your brain," Dr. Chen told him, comparing his latest scans to the baseline. "The old highways of self-criticism are being used less, while new pathways of self-awareness and conscious choice are being strengthened." This process wasn't just about changing thoughts, it was about changing the fundamental neural architecture that generated those thoughts. Marcus was learning to become the director of his own mental activity rather than its passive victim. He was discovering that the voice he'd believed was his authentic self was actually just one possible program his brain could run, and that he had the power to choose different programs. The implications went far beyond personal therapy. Dr. Chen's research suggested that many of the limitations people accepted as unchangeable aspects of their personality were actually learned patterns that could be unlearned. The shy person wasn't inherently shy, they had simply strengthened neural pathways associated with social withdrawal. The anxious person wasn't born anxious, they had trained their brain to anticipate threats. The unsuccessful person wasn't destined for failure, they had programmed their neural networks to expect and unconsciously create disappointing outcomes. But, perhaps the most revolutionary discovery in Dr. Chen's research was the concept of neural suicide, the brain's ability to essentially destroy old versions of itself to make room for new ones. This wasn't the dramatic, destructive process the term might suggest, but rather a careful dismantling of neural patterns that no longer served the person's growth and well-being. Every time you choose not to follow an old pattern, Dr. Chen explained, you're weakening the neural pathways that support it. Eventually, these pathways can become so weak that they no longer automatically activate. It's like allowing an unused road to become overgrown. Eventually, it's no longer a viable route. Marcus was experiencing this phenomenon firsthand. The voice that had once seemed like an unquestionable authority was beginning to sound more like a badly programmed computer, repetitive, predictable, and ultimately ignorable. He was learning to distinguish between his conscious awareness and the automatic mental chatter that had previously dominated his experience. The process wasn't always pleasant. As old neural patterns weakened, Marcus sometimes felt disoriented, as if he were losing his sense of self. Dr. Chen assured him this was normal, the brain's identity systems were being updated, and temporary confusion was a natural part of the process. "You're not losing yourself," she explained. "You're discovering yourself. The person you thought you were was actually just a collection of habits and assumptions. The real you, the conscious awareness that can observe and choose, is becoming stronger as those old patterns weaken." This conscious awareness, Dr. Chen's research suggested, was the key to true psychological freedom. It was the part of the mind that could observe thoughts without being controlled by them, feel emotions without being overwhelmed by them, and make choices based on wisdom rather than conditioning. Strengthening this aspect of consciousness was like developing a muscle, the more it was used, the stronger it became. As Marcus progressed through the study, he began to understand that destroying his weak self wasn't about becoming a different person, it was about becoming more authentically himself. The layers of fear, limitation, and self-doubt that he'd mistaken for his identity were actually barriers to his true nature. Removing these barriers didn't leave him empty or diminished, it revealed capacities and qualities that had always been there but had been obscured by years of negative conditioning. The neuroscience was clear, the brain that had created his prison could also engineer his freedom. The same neural plasticity that had trapped him in patterns of self-defeat could be harnessed to create patterns of self-empowerment. The question wasn't whether change was possible, it was whether he was willing to do the work required to make it happen. Part 3, The Indestructible Self and the Art of Neural Mastery. 6 months into Dr. Chen's study, Marcus barely recognized the person he had been. The transformation wasn't dramatic in the way Hollywood might portray it, no sudden moment of enlightenment or miraculous overnight change. Instead, it was more like watching a time-lapse video of a building being constructed, gradual, methodical, but ultimately resulting in something entirely new occupying the same space where nothing substantial had existed before. The most profound change wasn't in his circumstances, though those had improved considerably. He had applied for and received a promotion at work, started dating someone he genuinely cared about, and begun taking art classes, something he'd always wanted to do but had convinced himself he lacked the talent for. The real transformation was in his relationship with his own mind. He had learned to see his thoughts not as truths to be believed, but as phenomena to be observed. Dr. Chen called this final phase of her research neural sovereignty, the point at which a person becomes the conscious architect of their own mental experience rather than its unconscious victim. The brain scans told a remarkable story. The regions associated with self-awareness and conscious control were now significantly more active and better connected than when Marcus had started the study. Meanwhile, the areas linked to rumination, self-criticism, and threat detection had quieted to normal levels. "You've essentially rebuilt your neural operating system," Dr. Chen told him during their final session together. "The old programs are still there and neural pathways don't completely disappear, but they're no longer your default mode. You've created new, stronger pathways that support the person you've chosen to become." But the most fascinating aspect of Marcus's transformation, from Dr. Chen's scientific perspective, was how he had developed what she called anti-fragility at the neural level. This wasn't just resilience, the ability to bounce back from adversity, but something more powerful, the capacity to grow stronger from challenges that would have previously weakened him. The concept of anti-fragility, originally developed by the mathematician and philosopher Nassim Taleb, described systems that actually benefit from stress and chaos rather than merely surviving them. Dr. Chen had discovered that the human brain, when properly trained, could develop this quality at the neural level. People who had mastered conscious neural control didn't just handle criticism, failure, or setbacks better, they actually used these experiences to strengthen their sense of self and expand their capabilities. Marcus experienced this phenomenon firsthand when he received harsh feedback on a project at work. His old neural programming would have interpreted this as confirmation of his inadequacy, triggering a cascade of self-doubt and defensive behavior. Instead, his newly developed neural patterns allowed him to process the criticism objectively, extract useful information while discarding the emotional charge, and use the experience to improve his performance. "The criticism didn't hurt me," he explained to Dr. Chen. "I mean, I felt the initial sting, but then I noticed myself feeling it rather than being consumed by it. It was like watching clouds pass through the sky. I could see them, but they didn't define the weather of my entire inner landscape." This metaphor captured something essential about the transformation Dr. Chen had observed in her most successful research participants. They had learned to identify with the vast awareness that could observe thoughts and emotions rather than with the thoughts and emotions themselves. This shift in identity created what she called psychological untouchability, not because they avoided difficult experiences, but because they had developed an unshakable core that remained intact regardless of external circumstances. The neuroscience behind this transformation was fascinating. Brain scans of people who had achieved neural sovereignty showed a distinctive pattern: increased activity in the insula, a brain region associated with interoceptive awareness, awareness of internal bodily sensations, and stronger connections between the prefrontal cortex and limbic system. This suggested that they had developed superior ability to monitor their internal states and regulate their emotional responses. But, perhaps most significantly, these individuals showed decreased activity in the brain's narrative self networks, the regions responsible for creating and maintaining the story of who they are. This didn't mean they lost their sense of identity, rather, they became less attached to any particular story about themselves. They could hold their self-concept lightly, updating it based on new experiences rather than defending it against conflicting information. Dr. Chen had discovered that this flexibility of self-concept was crucial to becoming truly indestructible in a psychological sense. People who were rigidly attached to a particular identity, even a positive one, remained vulnerable to experiences that challenged that identity. But people who understood their identity as a fluid, conscious creation rather than a fixed reality could adapt and evolve without losing their essential sense of self. Marcus began to understand that his old weak self hadn't been destroyed so much as revealed to be an illusion. The fearful, limited person he'd believed himself to be had never really existed. It was just a story his brain had been telling, reinforced by selective attention to supporting evidence and filtered perception of reality. The process of neural transformation hadn't eliminated this story but had revealed it as one possible narrative among many. "I used to think my thoughts were me," Marcus reflected during one of his final sessions. "Now I realize I'm the one who's aware of the thoughts." It's like the difference between being a character in a movie and being the audience watching the movie. Both perspectives are real, but one gives you a lot more freedom and choice. This shift in perspective had profound practical implications. When his old patterns of self-doubt arose, and they still did occasionally, Marcus could observe them with curiosity rather than being swept away by them. He had developed what cognitive scientists called cognitive diffusion, the ability to step back from thoughts and see them as mental events rather than absolute truths. The techniques that had facilitated this transformation were surprisingly simple, though not always easy to implement. The key was consistent practice in catching automatic thoughts and consciously choosing different responses. Over time, this practice had literally rewired his brain, creating new neural superhighways that supported conscious choice while allowing old pathways of limitation to atrophy from disuse. One of the most powerful practices Dr. Chen had introduced was what she called neural debugging, the process of examining thoughts and beliefs as if they were code in a computer program. When Marcus noticed himself thinking, "I can't do this," he learned to ask, "Where did this programming come from? Is it based on current reality or past conditioning? Is this thought helping me or limiting me? What would I prefer to think instead?" This wasn't positive thinking or self-deception, it was conscious programming. Just as a software developer could examine code, identify bugs, and write better programs, Marcus had learned to examine his mental patterns, identify limitations, and consciously create more effective ways of thinking. The results spoke for themselves. Not only had his quality of life improved dramatically, but he had developed a kind of psychological immunity to the things that used to derail him. Criticism bounced off him like rain off an umbrella. Setbacks became learning opportunities. Challenges became chances to grow stronger. But, perhaps most importantly, he had discovered that his true self, the consciousness that could observe and choose, was indeed indestructible. It couldn't be hurt by criticism because it wasn't defined by others' opinions. It couldn't be diminished by failure because it wasn't attached to outcomes. It couldn't be weakened by adversity because it grew stronger through conscious engagement with difficulty. Dr. Chen's research had revealed that this indestructible core wasn't something people had to develop, it was something they had to uncover. Underneath all the layers of conditioning, programming, and learned limitation, there existed a fundamental awareness that was already whole, complete, and unshakable. The process of neural transformation wasn't about creating something new but about removing the barriers to what was already there. The person you've become isn't really new, Dr. Chen told Marcus during their final meeting. It's who you always were underneath all the programming. The fearful, limited identity was the temporary illusion. The confident, capable, aware person you are now, that's your natural state. As Marcus left Dr. Chen's office for the last time, he carried with him not just the transformation he had achieved, but the knowledge of how he had achieved it. He understood that neural sovereignty wasn't a destination but a practice, a conscious choice he would need to make again and again throughout his life. But he also knew that each time he chose awareness over automaticity, consciousness over conditioning, growth over safety, he was strengthening the neural pathways that supported his highest potential. The weak self that had once seemed so permanent, so real, so unchangeable, had been revealed as nothing more than a pattern of brain activity that could be consciously modified. In destroying this illusion of limitation, Marcus had discovered something that truly was indestructible, the awareness that could observe all mental phenomena without being defined or confined by any of them. He walked out into the afternoon sun, no longer a prisoner of yesterday's conditioning but the conscious architect of tomorrow's possibilities. His brain, once his jailer, had become his most powerful ally in creating a life of unlimited potential. The man who had learned to destroy his weak self had indeed become indestructible, not because he was invulnerable to life's challenges, but because he had discovered a core of consciousness that no external circumstance could touch. In the end, Dr. Chen's research had proven something that mystics and philosophers had long suspected but science had struggled to validate: the most profound transformation possible for a human being wasn't changing their circumstances but changing their relationship to their own mind. Once that transformation occurred, all other changes became not just possible but inevitable. The neural pathways were carved, the new programs were installed, and the indestructible self had emerged from the ashes of its own limiting beliefs. Marcus's journey was complete, but, in another sense, it was just beginning, for he now possessed the knowledge and tools to continue evolving, growing, and transforming for the rest of his life. The man who destroys his weak self, as the ancient wisdom had promised, can indeed never be destroyed by others, for he has discovered the unshakable foundation of consciousness itself, and, from that foundation, anything becomes possible. This document represents a synthesis of current neuroscientific research, psychological principles, and philosophical insights into the nature of identity, transformation, and human potential. While the characters and specific scenarios are fictional, the underlying science and transformational principles are grounded in contemporary research in neuroplasticity, cognitive psychology, and consciousness studies.